I think we're on.
The Dr. Oba T'Shaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow. A show for all who are on the journey to discover the truths about their identity, history, culture, politics, spirituality, and family relationships. This is a show for the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Power generation and the hip-hop generation, including Black Lives Matter and associate activists, all of whom are seeking change. Dr. Oba T'Shaka and his guests are dropping knowledge and insight from his successful organizing, research, writings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. To the bosses, OGs, rappers, influencers, and those looking to evolve from the constraints of misinformation and miseducation to build a foundation for personal growth, love, and mental freedom. Check out the wisdom of the OR. Yeah, that's the original revolutionary, Oba T, who inspired 1 million black men with his rousing speech at the Million Man March, and who continues to fight, write, and speak the truth. Dr. Oba T'Shaka is one of the deepest deep thinkers in the world today. A quote by Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Oba T'Shaka, then Bill Bradley, was the best leader organizer in the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. An endorsement from Dr. George Wiley, Associate Director of National CORE and the best organizer blacks produced in the 1970s as the organizer of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Dr. Oba T'Shaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow.
Greetings, viewers. How you all doing? We got a nice little menu for you today. For you who are in need of intellectual nourishment, we're going to have, in fact, we've got a real heavy brother here, and we're going to be discussing Brother El Haj Malik El Shabazz. Before getting into that, I want to acknowledge some of the viewers that have come on. Brother Ogawa, the backbone of this show, who's working hardest working man in the YouTube, Twitter business. Sister Robin, one of our most dedicated viewers and conscious viewers. Stephen McKenzie, Gregory Jones, M. Jewell, Gloria Briscoe. Greetings to you and others as you come on the show. Greetings, Brother Winbush. How you doing, brother?
What's up, Brother Shabaka? Good. It's always Shaka. I'm sorry. It's always good to see you, man.
Yeah, same here. You know, for those that haven't watched our early shows, one of our first shows, Dr. Winbush was on with an Afro-Haitian sister, and we were dealing with the subject of some blacks who have disassociated themselves from Africa. What was the name of that group, Raymond?
Oh man, you were going to put. You talking about the anti-reparations group that says that they are reparations people.
The ones that threaten your life.
Man, I don't want to get into that. I know what you're talking about, because every time I bring them up, they're like, you know, when you pick up rocks and these little bugs crawl out from under.
So that was one of our first shows, ADOS, as Brother Ogawa was reminding us, ADOS. And
went on and said it, yeah.
Every now and then, Ogawa has to get in the weeds with them and whatnot. So yeah, that was one of our first shows, and it was a good documentation on ADOS. I provided some good history.
Yeah.
So that was one. You and I, we go back quite a ways, brother.
I was trying to think I remember we went to Ghana together back in the early 2000s, but it was NBUF, I guess. Was it an NBUF?
First of all, Fisk, because you were in charge of the Race Relations Institute.
Right.
Fisk? Or was that at Fisk?
I think it was. Yeah, that was at Fisk. And you came to
me out and you had me speak a number of times.
That's right.
Chairs, some panels, one of which was leading hip hopper. And then you went to Ghana in 2000 and brought me along. It's one of the few times that someone else has paid my way. I got so tired of paying my way to Africa. I said, it's about time somebody else throws in some change. So you threw in some change. I brought
you that. That's right. I forgot about that. Yeah.
I brought my mother. My mother had never been to Africa.
Right. And
that was 5 years before she passed. So she was 85 then.
Wow.
84 in August. And so she went, she said, to honor me because she knew how much I loved Africa. And so she was there. So that was one. And we went there because you were trying to get the W.B. Du Bois papers. Remember?
Yeah. They were deteriorating at the Institute in Accra. Mm-hmm. And just about 10 years before that, we had met with Jerry Rawlings, the prime minister or president of Ghana. And we had given it was NCBS. We gave money and books and a bunch of things, and it's deteriorated a lot. That center really needs some type of support, and Skip Gates came in and did some things with it, but it still is not where it should be, definitely.
Yeah, and I was able to get a copy of one of Du Bois's notebooks, which was a survey of his work on that project. Because for people that don't know, Kwame Nkrumah, president of Ghana, the first president of a inter-African state in the 50s or 60s, the Sudan was the first to become independent. He asked Du Bois to write the Encyclopedia Africana. And so he started on that project, and he's buried on that site in the W.B. Du Bois Center there.
Right.
So you were there to do that. Plus, you were trying to counter what Skip Gates was doing at Harvard, because he was trying to get those same papers. So, yeah.
Well, he had done that thing called Africana, which it was one of the, Gates, that book it was a book about Africa that did not even have a definition of Africa in it. And I pointed it out, and he was very upset about that. I was at Fisk at that time, and in fact, he tried to get me fired from Fisk by writing a letter. I had never told you this, but Gates wrote a letter to my president at Fisk and tried to get me fired because he said that I had been critical of Africana, which was a terrible book and still remains a terrible book.
Yeah,
but, I'll probably get sued for some of the stuff I'm saying, but go on.
Yeah, well, Skip Gates, in that respect, played the role of Booker T. Washington, because Booker T. Washington would determine whether you got hired or fired.
That's right.
University, along with a job or anything else. So, Skippy Gates has played that role, and basically serving the role as the power elite. The white power elite calls the Harvard team, they used to call them the dream team. For us, it's a nightmare team, because it was used against Afrocentricity and Negroism, and pushing Negroism, and was always talking about how proud he was to be in the academy, and not pushing our interests.
Yeah, I think in my first book, Warrior Method, I referred to Gates as the Booker T. Washington of Black Studies, because he determined so much, and people, no matter where he went, it was considered as being the best Black Studies program. If he had gone to the University of Montana, I guess it would have been the best Black Studies program. And, I think we've always had people in our community that, whites are very comfortable with them, and that comfort allows them to advance in our communities, unfortunately, and oftentimes our own detriment.
Yeah, and the white power elite, while they don't want Black studies or Africana studies, period, having to face the fact that we exist, then prop up a version that's amenable to them and that serves as a attack dog on us. So when Leonard Jeffries was under attack, my department, Black Studies at San Francisco State, which is the mothership, and Center for Inner City Studies, which is now Center for Jacob Carruthers Studies, and even Molefi Asante's PhD program, they came under attack.
That's right.
From them. And in fact, in the midst of our attack in 90, Skip Gates actually comes out to San Francisco State, has a dinner with the president, and then says, because we sent a spy to the meeting, he then says he never heard of Black Studies at San Francisco State.
Well, that's like saying you never knew there was a sun in the sky. I mean, San Francisco State was the birthplace of the modern Black Studies movement. Nathan Hare, that whole, that was the model, the publication of the Black Scholar that Nathan and Julia and everybody put together. That was like ground zero for Black Studies.
Yeah, exactly. And my first thing when I became chair, I hired Nathan because he had been whiteballed during the strike. There's a whole story too. I won't go into it. And he couldn't be hired anywhere, though he eventually was offered a job in New York. He told me this a couple of years ago. Didn't go because he wanted to push his wife's career, and she was in broadcasting.
Yeah.
And, KGO radio and whatnot. So
right.
But other than that, there were no jobs for him. And he really sets up the first Black Studies curriculum. Because he brought in his genius. His brother's a genius. He ain't Afrocentric. He and I have little discussions on that. But I don't really care. He's Black and he's for Black people. And he's also a boxer.
That's right.
Intellectually and physically. When I was at Howard, I spoke on my book on Malcolm in 1984, and they had fight films on him. Man, that guy was so fast. He'd get in the ring and hit you 3 or 4 times, you were knocked out. That was it. That was Nathan. You know what I mean?
People don't know that part of Nathan, but he was a strong brother, boy.
Yeah.
Good boxer too.
Yeah, still is. And he took care of his wife when she had Alzheimer's.
That's right.
He's taking care of her for a good 12 years. You know what I mean? So yeah, he's a giant. Yeah. So to say you didn't hear of Black Studies at San Francisco State is like saying you don't know your mama, because that's the mama and father of Black Studies. Yeah. But what he was saying was, go ahead and kill us. It's all right. You know what I mean? Huh?
Yeah.
Oh, Skippy Gates. So. Yeah. So that's, we go back a long time. People should know that Dr. Raymond Winbush is a distinguished scholar and community activist. He's written a book on reparations. What's the name of your book?
Should America Pay? Slavery and the Raging Debate on Reparations, and another one called Belinda's Petition, about a sister in Massachusetts in 1781 who fought for reparations and received them in 1785.
Right on. Yeah. So, and you've been deeply engaged in the reparations movement and generally engaged in our people's movements in general. And I joked the last time I had you on the show, I said, usually people who graduate from the University of Chicago or Harvard or Yale, they're functionally useless to us. And so I basically was joking with you. And I said, what happened to you? And you had 2 words for a person that turned you around. You remember that person?
Bobby Wright. Bobby Wright graduated and people in the audience don't know, Bobby Wright I would have to consider him one of my three most important mentors in my life. And he was a student at Chicago at the same time. There were four of us there, Black folk, in 1970, which is 53 years ago. And that place was something else. But Bobby helped me through. Bobby predicted in 1970 that people would have computers in their hands by the year 2000. And at that time, people remember the IBM 360, but Bobby was into that, and he was prophetic in that. So he was my mentor.
Right. And he coined the term the psychopathic racist personality.
That's right. I mean, that's a paper everybody's got to read. Everybody's got to read that.
So today the topic is the groundbreaking book, The Dead Are Arising, which is on the promotional for this show. And this is a copy of the book by Les Payne. And so this is going to be the topic for this discussion. And you're the one that told me about the book because I didn't know about it, got it and read it and saw just why you had recommended it. But before getting into that, I thought it would be good for you and I to just talk generally about the context of Malcolm X himself and his overall contribution, some of the things that you think make Malcolm significant for our people. And we'll put up a little slide thing on Malcolm while we're doing that, So what do you see as some of the things? This is a picture of Malcolm with Adam Clayton Powell.
Yeah.
What do you see some of the important contributions that Malcolm made to us as a people?
Well, it's almost impossible in this show to talk about Malcolm's contribution. I mean, I told somebody the other day that we need another Malcolm. If we had half of the honesty that Malcolm had about being Black in the world, not just in America, but just being Black in the world, and also Malcolm's unapologetic, attack and, discussion of white supremacy and the role that it plays in, twisting, Black ideas, Black thought. I mean, it's almost impossible to, and then his life itself. I mean, a life that, started off, in a place in Michigan and evolved into what most people would have thought would have been a life of destruction, winding up in prison and other things, but then becoming probably the greatest Black leader or one of the greatest Black leaders of the 20th century. So, I think the books that have been written on Malcolm, I think a lot of them give a piece of them, but I think a lot of them also had, as I had told you before, I think they had axes to grind. And I think that The Dead Are Rising is one of the best books that's been written about him.
Yeah, we're going to get into that. This is a picture of Malcolm's mother, yes, Louise Langdon Little, and we'll talk about her in this show. And in fact, I did a show on her exclusively. This is Malcolm and Castro.
Yeah.
And, Castro had come to the United States to speak before the UN and could not get a room in a downtown hotel. And Malcolm got him into the Hotel Teresa and in Harlem. And you can see the joy on his face because Malcolm was a revolutionary. And this did not exactly make Elijah Muhammad happy because this had put some heat on him coming from the government. But you can just see from that, that's a nice picture there.
It is. Beautiful picture.
And again, Castro again. And this is Malcolm at a core demonstration in New York. Core had the greatest impact on Malcolm's thinking from the Black Freedom Movement. He was impressed by both SNCC. He was more impressed by King than his propaganda indicated.
That's right.
But because Core was wherever the nation was in the North, Congress of Racial Equality, which I come out of, that's where he had his interaction. And this was probably a construction site demonstration because that's what New York Core, there's a bunch of New York Core chapters, you know. And this is his home where he was born in, right here.
That's it.
And Mr. Manning Marble, who did the snow job on Malcolm.
Boy, you go.
Book.
Okay.
This is my book on Malcolm, which is generally regarded, it's been rated #1 in New York Times, the best book on Malcolm. And Asa Hilliard, when reviewing the book, said you could read all of the autobiography and not get a sense of Malcolm's political direction.
Right.
And he said this book had eclipsed both. So, yeah. So, any other comments you want to make on Malcolm's overall contribution?
Oh, I mean, you where do you begin? I mean, the issue of Black pride. The one regret I have in my childhood was my brother and I. We were like 12 years old, raised in Cleveland, and Malcolm was speaking down the street, and my father told me that we should go hear him. He went. And we made a choice of going to a Cleveland Browns football game. And I regret that to this day. Theodore X was the minister at the mosque in Cleveland at that time. So it would have been about like 1962, 61, something like that. So, but I mean, Malcolm's idea of Black pride, I mean, King talked about integration. And I always, as you just kind of, hinted at, I don't like people talking about this like dichotomy between Malcolm and Martin. I think they had a lot of synergy with each other, but Malcolm clearly emphasized the issue of Black pride being, prideful in oneself. So I think that's another major contribution of Malcolm.
Yeah, and talking about the meetings, people who have heard this before from me know that in 1963, I had assumed chairmanship of San Francisco Core, which ended up leading the only successful Black freedom, Black power movement in the North. And Malcolm increasingly came under the influence of what he called the Young Turks. He was asking us for direction while we were getting direction from him. And so what he would do is have meetings in different parts of the country with the Young Turks. So he had a meeting with us. I had just become chair of San Francisco Core January of 1963 when I cashiered out of the Marine Reserves. I'd been brainwashed and been in it for 6 years and had started to undergo an awakening. In fact, I had undergone the same awakening Malcolm underwent prior to that meeting. Malcolm underwent an awakening that was key to his growth and development that Cabral went through, that I call the 6-fold stages to mental freedom. We're going to do a webinar, a year-long webinar on this. People to sign up. As soon as we have 40, we'll do it. So Malcolm had asked for about 60 people to come, and about 15 came. And it was at the Sun Reporter newspaper building, which was owned by a Black multimillionaire radical, Carlton Goodlett. You ever heard of Carlton Goodlett?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
PhD in psychology and an MD degree from Meharry. And when Paul Robeson was denied the right to travel, his passport was taken, then Goodlett was the one that traveled in his place. And Goodlett was a big supporter of the movement, So when we came into the meeting, Malcolm's back was facing the wall. And he had a newspaper in front of him. One of them was the New York Times. And that was his habit to always, in informal discussions, to use that as a basis for discussion. When we get into his mother, we'll see how that ties into her influences. Malcolm always sat with his back to a wall. He never sat where his back was facing a street or anything else. And with him was the minister from Los Angeles. And Malcolm had been engaged in a battle because the LA police had killed and wounded LA members of the Nation of Islam. And Malcolm had tried to get Elijah Muhammad to support some kind of campaign to oppose that, and Elijah didn't. And so both of them were dressed in seersucker suits, these cheap-looking suits that you wear during the summer in hot weather, you know what I mean? And so Malcolm did a discourse on the movement and the importance of the Nation of Islam in the movement. And then he opened the audience up for questions. And so when he opened the audience up for questions, I asked him, why wasn't the Nation of Islam engaged in the Black Freedom Movement? We were leading the most comprehensive. At that point, it was at the middle, well, actually the beginning of this job campaign. We defeated an entire economic power structure. And guess who was among those getting jobs?
Who's that?
Striped, bow tie wearing Nation of Islam members, along with other blacks. You know what I mean? They walking in and getting the job, but they ain't doing nothing. So I'm asking him, why in the hell aren't you all out engaged in this movement? We did not know that Malcolm had that same conversation with Elijah. He was trying to push the nation to engage with the movement, not nonviolence, not integration, but demonstrations for the right to vote, to end segregation, rent strikes, a whole bunch of things. The kind of job demonstrations we were having, Malcolm was sympathetic of. That's what he was learning from CORE in different parts of the country. In fact, one of his brothers, is not his oldest, but one of his older brothers in Make It Plain, the film Make It Plain, he says Malcolm was starting to sound more like the civil rights or Black freedom movement than the Nation of Islam, because we were shifting his thought as he was shifting ours. And so, and then I was critical of him on some of the statements he had made about King, that King was a Tom and that King was picked by the white power structure. I pointed out, King wasn't picked up by no white power structure, and he wasn't no Tom. And so then Malcolm's response was, but for the Nation of Islam, the power structure wouldn't want to deal with you. That was a common answer that he gave because they were afraid of the power structure. My response was, the power structure is not afraid of the Nation of Islam. White people may be. That fear produced was put on by Mike Wallace. That probably put a scare out there. But the power structure ain't afraid of you. So then Malcolm backed off. And when he backed off, he came back and said this. The messenger would be announcing a political action program soon. And I didn't know, nobody knew what that meant. And then a few months later, he's forced out, he's put on suspension and then later forced out on Chickens Come Home to Roost. And then later he explains that he was trying to move the messenger in that direction. He was hopeful at that point that the messenger would announce a political action program soon. And my father went to that meeting with me, and he noted that Malcolm had a bump that would go up and down the back of his neck, when he was speaking. So for me, I had two major masters in the movement. Garvey was my first, Malcolm was my second. I wear a goatee because Malcolm did. I used to talk like Malcolm, like a whole lot of us did. Brother Malcolm said this and that. When I wrote the first draft of this book on Malcolm X, I gave it to Jacob Carruthers. Conrad Worrell had introduced me to Jake, and Jake read it. And he said, I can't tell where you end and Malcolm begins. I was so entangled in his personality and learning from him. And for me, his intellectual stuff, along with his organizing, because I'm into both, and I wasn't conscious of that at that time, that drew me to him. But the main thing that drew me to him was his integrity,
Well, it's interesting that, and you and I both know, and everybody does, that Malcolm met with Dr. King right before the Selma to Montgomery March. And I really believe had Malcolm not been assassinated, that would have been created the greatest coalition that ever was in terms of Black freedom movement in this country. And Malcolm was clearly more sympathetic towards, you know, how can I put it, towards the civil rights movement. And it didn't mean that he supported this whole idea of integration. And we better talk about some of the things that are in the autobiography. But it's like, I think this idea of opposing Malcolm and Martin is something that's always been very distasteful to me. There's been debates about, well, Malcolm or Martin, you know, like oppositional, and you know, and all of that stuff to me, you know, creates this idea that somehow they were, you know, in opposition, and they weren't. Malcolm said some things, like you said, about King, especially in the message to the grassroots in 63, I believe it was, that, you know, in Detroit. And he probably regretted some of that, you know, I'm sure. But there's that, you know, incredible picture of Malcolm and Martin when the Civil Rights Bill was passed in 64, laughing at the Capitol with each other. And it's clear that they were very, very close towards the end of Malcolm's life.
Yeah, and in fact, when Malcolm is forced out of the nation, Malcolm is now reaching out to the Black Freedom Movement, and he actually has a meeting, Sidney Poitier's house, where he meets with the Urban League. He's meeting with the NAACP, King Center representative, CORE, SNCC. He was trying to form some kind of coalition with the Black Freedom Movement. So that was one piece. And as you pointed out in our discussion, a few days before his assassination, he spoke to the students in Selma. And that was a combination of King, but especially SNCC. And King was in jail, and his wife was sitting on the platform, and they had talked before a discussion. Both of them ended up being revolutionaries, both of them. And King supported Malcolm's human rights position. And as I've shown before on the show that we've had on King the Revolutionary, Menu Ampin, who's the authority on that, he's written a book on the revolutionary Martin Luther King. It's actually his master's thesis. He hasn't put it in book form. It's the best account of King of any writer. And he's pointing out how King, by 65, had concluded civil rights movement was over, and it was a human rights movement. But he was more practical than Malcolm. Malcolm, the human rights movement, was the international arena. He was taking the Black Freedom Movement and internationalizing it, taking it to the Organization of African Unity, and wanted to take it to the UN and the World Court and other bodies. But King was making the point, and King supported that, by the way. But King made the point that when you get to this point of the issue of human rights, we're now at a different stage of the struggle. You got the right to vote. You got the ending of legal apartheid. But he said, we're now in another stage that the Constitution doesn't grant, which is a roof over your head, a guaranteed job, health care, fundamental powers that the Constitution doesn't give you. And then he said the country needed to be restructured.
That's right.
He was anti-capitalist. He never liked capitalism. He read Marx. Malcolm didn't have to. And he didn't. But
and you know, and I think that's, you know, Vincent Harding wrote an article, well, it must be 20 years old. It was called The Last 5 Years of Dr. Martin Luther King. And he says something that it just stands out in my mind. He says that a lot of the nation embalmed King on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963. And it's like that's, you know, we boiled Malcolm down to 4 words, by any means necessary. And we boiled Dr. King down to 4 words, I have a dream. And both of these men did much more than just those 4 words. King's revolutionary period, he was clearly, as you point out, influenced by Malcolm. But in the last 5 years of his life, he was speaking, he was talking about shutting down a city, Chicago, the Chicago campaign. Carmichael joined him up there at that time. And Carmichael even says how he had to restructure how SNCC had been operating in the South if they were going to operate in the North because of the Chicago campaign. So that's when King, of course, made his denunciation of the Vietnam War at Riverside Church. But we just like don't talk about those last 5 years of King enough. We really don't.
Right. Yeah, and King's lawyer was the intermediary between King and Malcolm, and so they would pass information back and forward. And when King went to get the Nobel Prize, he had been in contact through his lawyer with Malcolm, and it agreed. And in the book, The Judas Factor, it points that out, that he would take a stand against American involvement in the Congo. And he timed his statements to be in coordination with Malcolm, because Malcolm was dead on the Congo. By the way, John Henry Clark was his principal African advisor. And John and I apprenticed under him. We were friends. And John told me that he gave Malcolm advice on African policy. And in this particular case, Malcolm was going to debate the foremost scholars on the Congo, on not the ancient history, but what's going on since slavery and colonialism. So he needed information. So he sent one of his people by to collect some stuff. And so John gave him Mark Twain's Soliloquy on the Congo, which is, he was a radical on foreign policy. And Malcolm was a quick reader and a quick study. And John considered him, and most of us do, to have the sharpest, I would say, political mind. Some people would say sharpest mind, sharpest political. He wasn't a physicist or anything like that. Historian, okay, but political mind. And so he ate those scholars up, and he had been briefed in about 10 minutes. That was Malcolm. And I've seen Malcolm in a debate whip an opponent without debating him. Now, that is what you call winning a war without a fight. We had an Uncle Tom in San Francisco. His name was Terry Francois.
You gonna name him? Go ahead.
In this particular case, he sold us out in the movement. He's dead now, head of the NAACP. I'd actually got him to, be our lawyer for something and sold us out and stuff. So he's debating Malcolm with his head bowed, never looking at him straight in the eye. Malcolm whipped him without even referring to him. He didn't deal with an argument. He just pushed him to the side. Boom, 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 boom. I said, check this out. Yeah, so that was Malcolm. So yeah, so that's a kind of a context. So let's get into The Dead Are Rising, the biography of Malcolm X. When we were shaping the questions, Raymond, you said it was very important to distinguish between the value of a biography and an autobiography. So first of all, just for people that may not be clear on this, define the difference between an autobiography. What's an autobiography as opposed to a biography first?
Well, autobiography is a book written by the person themselves about themselves. The autobiography of Malcolm X, although that even qualifies a little bit different, but I don't know, Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery is a good example. W.B. Du Bois's book, Dusk at Dawn, those were books written, or the young Angela Davis, when she wrote her autobiography at 30 years old, because as you and I were talking the other day, because of Toni Morrison, a biography is when you write a book about a person's life. You see biographies written about John Henry Clark. You see biographies written about Malcolm X, the one that we're discussing today, in fact. So a biography is a person writing a book about someone else. Again, there's, kind of some craziness with that. Claiborne Carson's autobiography of Martin Luther King. I don't know what that was about. I detest, as many people have heard, Manny Marable's biography of Malcolm X, which I think is probably the worst one of all. So
Bruce Perry was actually even worse.
Yeah, that it's hard to, and these guys got axes to grind. And I don't want to get into some of that, but they do have axes to grind. And I think when you read a biography of a person, you should ask yourself, what do they come to that table with? What do they want to prove? What do they want to, how do they want to make this person look bad in some cases? Or it can be what it's called a hagiography, when you just want to make a person look good, all the time. So you got to know, when you're reading biography, what is that person bringing to the table as they write about that person.
There's a note here from Chi. After King's 1966 campaign in Chicago, Richard Daley in 1967 created the Gang Intelligence Unit to go after the street organizations that worked with King. Want to make any comment on that?
Well, when I was doing some research on a film a couple years ago, Daley, after that Chicago campaign, really freaked out. And, and also just a few years later, right after King was assassinated, with the Democratic Convention in 1968, there's a file at the Chicago Historical Society called the Red File. And if you ever have a chance, you ought to read it. I mean, he was spying on everybody. Daley was. It didn't include the King organization. It included Conrad, who we both know. It included Fred Hampton. I used a lot of that information when we would, for the research on the film Judas and the Black Messiah. So Daley was paranoid after King's Chicago campaign, because Daley was a control freak. He thought that the city was his and belonged to him, and he set out a spy network that was in conjunction with Fred Hanrahan, who was at that time state's attorney, the FBI, and the Chicago police force, and they were spying on everybody at that time.
Yeah, and what also happens is, because in King's campaign after his assassination, his Poor People's Campaign in Washington, a number of gangs in Chicago joined that, and they actually changed their name, to Blackstone P Nation. Right. And they had also been radicalized by later the Black Panther Party as well. And so what ends up happening also is the FBI, through COINTELPRO, they begin to fund some of these gang leaders, surface them, giving them money, and then kill them.
That's right. That's right.
I have a whole series of books on the counterintelligence program used against the gangs, because the mayor, the police, they like gangs. As long as these gangs are out there doing what they think they're supposed to do, which is engage in criminal activity and basically against Black people. But when they become politicized, they're scared to death of them, especially when you got thousands of them. You know what I mean? So yeah, that was key. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think the COINTELPRO era is, in my recollection, was one of the worst eras, because there was a lot of mistrust generated by the FBI and so forth, with a lot of organizations. I don't even want to mention some of them, but I think that COINTEL's type of tactics are still operating in many of our movements today, particularly the reparations struggle. As we near, discussing and implementing reparations, you see a lot of infiltration at that level. And some of it is government oriented, orchestrated. And I can prove that's another discussion. But it's very important to us to realize that our movements are not looked upon passively. A lot of times the government wants to disrupt movements that, talk about Black freedom. especially at the international level. So we've got to be aware of how COINTELPRO like type of things operate today as well.
I want to remind people, hit the like button, fool these algorithms. 2, subscribe. I see some new people. Subscribe to the show. And 3, make a donation. I'm paying for this show out of my pocket. You don't see no corporations up here. And I got some hardcore followers, so they would give me a little money. I've been fighting corporations all my life. So, and I put a lot of money into this show, so put something out. Now, in terms of COINTELPRO, I faced 3 COINTELPRO attacks on my life. 1,
Wow.
15 cats came to kill me. This finger here, I fought them off. 2, a guy came to my house to shoot me, and we're martial artists, so we're both trained in disarmament. And then 3, they ran a person on my group to kill my whole group. And that was a person that had organized the Simeonese Liberation Army, which I note that Les Payne wrote about. I don't know if he knew that was an FBI cutout. So I faced that. Plus, they took a job from me. I've never lost a battle. I could have won. My spirit told me not to fight it. And 3 years later, I'm teaching at San Francisco State. They took a job in the public schools, the junior high school. They were going to get me a provisional teaching credential. They wrote a 17-page report saying that I was a criminal, shouldn't be getting it, and I knew I could beat that. My spirit said no, because my spirit knew better. My spirit knew I wasn't suited for the public schools. I'm university because of the stuff I'm teaching, but I like teaching, period. Now, the key thing about COINTELPRO is this. A, if you get into the kitchen, you better be able to handle the grease. You better know that your enemy, whether you're effective or not, is going to come after you in some kind of way. He might. So you take measures. The first thing is study your enemy. Know your enemy. My books, The Art of Leadership, are based on that. It took me 10 years to write these books so that Black folks could have them. I got 2 volumes of these. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so in the case of what's the main reason that COINTELPRO worked? Division within groups.
That's right.
And that was true with the Us and Panthers. They tried to play that between the Panthers and the gangs, but Fred Hampton was too effective with that, and the gangs were going along with him, so they shot him in his sleep.
That's
You
right.
got to have security measures that tell you who's in your group. Now, the rule in this one is you're going to get penetrated no matter what. If you're above ground, somebody in your group's going to be an agent. That's just going to happen. What you then do is protect yourself against what agents do. And that means you have to have a security section. Security section isn't like, because my group has the martial artists and stuff, but I have no dumb people in any of my groups. I hate to say that, but there's no dumb people. You got to be smart and with integrity. And so we have a security section. Those are people who check you out. And that saved us, because the guy that came in to burn us up, because he had burned the Simeonese Liberation Army alive, I spotted him right away. Now, here's the thing to note. I'm not going into this now, but the most sophisticated thing they're using on us now is not COINTELPRO, it's low-intensity operations. And my book, The Art of Leadership, Volume 2, goes into that. When they move on you on low-intensity operations, if you're at the amateur hour operation level, you won't even know what happens. And when they do you in, the community won't know how you were done in. So you have to study this stuff. Can't lead unless you read, but you got to control your ego, because the key reason the groups I've been in have not suffered from major attacks is we had excellent relationships with all the groups we're dealing with. You couldn't pit them against us or us against them. That's a key one, but that's an important point you're raising. And in the case of a king who didn't have those kind of issues, they just went out and got a sniper and shot him. And that was military intelligence that shot him, by the way. You're celebrating King's birthday. It was your government that took him out. And it had to take an order from the highest level of the political leaders of the U.S. for that to happen, because military intelligence ain't taking out no civilian in the United States unless they're ordered to.
But you know something else, Doc, that they do. We always find out these infiltrators you know, after the fact, like what's the brother that was taking pictures of Martin Luther King? I can't call his name, but we found that out after King was assassinated. The first black FBI agent that was hired by J. Edgar Hoover when it was still the Bureau of Investigation was a brother taught to spy on Marcus Garvey. But it's like when you say that while they're in the group, like there's one I'm thinking about. I don't want to call his name because he's still alive, but his initials are JG. You know who I'm talking about.
Right.
This guy, if you say it at the time, they say, "Oh man, you're being paranoid or you're being you're overreacting." It's almost like they discredit you from talking about their infiltration at the time they're doing their infiltration.
That's why it's essential that you do your documentation, because it is very wrong to label anybody an agent unless you got solid proof.
Right.
Because that can lead to harm, certainly their reputation or their life. And
Sure.
also, when you're running a group, it leads to agent paranoia. But when you know you got the facts, then there are various moves you have to make then. So that's an organizing thing. But a lot of us, we got this agent phobia that will also kill us.
Yeah.
And a lot of us have weaknesses. We all have weaknesses, and they're going to exploit your weaknesses. So you got to work on your weaknesses. You know what I mean?
Right. That's
they
right.
can't run through them.
Exactly.
Getting into the autobiography thing. So you consider the biography to be an overall more reliable portrayal of a person's life than an autobiography. Is that correct? And if so, why?
Well, let me put it this way. I think autobiography is something that I love reading. I love reading autobiography and biography because I want to hear what the person, him or herself, says about him or herself. But I also know that in autobiography, we leave out certain things that we don't want the public to know. Most of us, if we wrote our own autobiographies, we would leave out things that we don't want people to know about. I think Malcolm did a lot of that in the autobiography. I want to give one example. It was always said, or Malcolm always said, that his father was killed by the Klan, put on a railroad track, probably tied down or whatever. And a train trolley ran over him. I think that Les Payne corrects that in The Dead Are Rising by saying that most likely it was in the wintertime, Malcolm's father literally just slipped and kind of fell under the tracks, and that's how he died. I don't know if Malcolm knew that or not. I also think there's weakness in biography too. That's one reason why I just really have problems with Manning Marable's portrayal of Malcolm. He does a lot. It's a sensational portrayal of Malcolm, primarily based on FBI files, and the FBI was no friend of Malcolm. Jared Ball did a book, and I did a chapter in it, and I literally counted up. It was a counterpoint to what was the name of that trash that he wrote? The Life of Reinvention. I'm sorry, A Life of Reinvention. Right. That's what Manning Marable's name of the book on Malcolm was, and we wrote, or I should say, Jared Ball and Todd Burrows wrote a counterpoint to it called A Lie of Reinvention, and we systematically took apart Manning's book. I counted up 1,600 references in the book. It was a very tedious thing that I did, and then classified them. The majority of what came from the FBI and hostile places. And the interesting thing is that even though Manning Marable at the time was teaching at Columbia University, and one of Malcolm's, well, Betty, his widow, was living there, he never interviewed her. And I think that's the strength of Payne's book and his daughter, is that they both interview members of Malcolm's family, and they added to the autobiography. So there's strengths and weaknesses in both autobiography and biography.
Yeah, I would give a few examples of what a person has an interest in covering up, and particularly Malcolm's information in the autobiography conveyed to him, to Alex Haley, and what comes out in other books, in particular, a very important book called The Seventh Child.
Yeah.
And my book on Malcolm is the first one, The Political Legacy of Malcolm X, to note the central influence of family on Malcolm. And most people think that because Malcolm was political, you look at him through the political lens. But Malcolm's political lens, his political orientation from non-politics to politics, hustling to, Black nationalism, Nation of Islam, revolutionary thought, was heavily influenced by his family. But that was true of everything that happened. So the autobiography, in the autobiography, Shorty is the one that introduces Malcolm to street life. He comes from his same town, and his creds are that he's a struggling musician and he's into street activity. And so he's taken young Malcolm through this. So according to the autobiography, it's Shorty that introduces Malcolm to the conch. That's for people that don't know, where you get your hair straight, and it nearly straightens your brain. I mean, does it in. I mean, if that conch stays too long, you're going to have lumps on your head like you never had before.
That's right.
And so he describes this then as how proud he was of it, and he had red hair and shit. And but then later he said it was my step into degradation. But he wasn't telling you what really happened. It wasn't Shorty that introduced him to the conch. You read The Seventh Child, because The Seventh Child is Malcolm's sister, Ella's writing of Malcolm. She died before it was put out. So her son, Rodnell Collins, with the assistance of Peter Baylor, who actually, I think, wrote most of the book, this is an account of the family's view of Malcolm. And, when the family tells stuff on you, it ain't like you're some hero. They're going to just tell it straight.
That's right. That's right.
So this is something not to be ashamed of, but what does Malcolm say about this? He says, that Shorty did this, but what does the family say? Malcolm was influenced by one of his older brothers who was 6'4", who was a singer and was the boyfriend of Lady Day.
That's right.
And he wore a conch, and that was Malcolm's first introduction to the conch. Now, here's the thing. He didn't hate himself. It just so happened that was a style. Yeah, you could say there's some brainwashing there, but this was a proud Black man. And Malcolm was being introduced to something that was considered to be hip and cool coming out of jazz. And this is a bad brother, 6'4", Black as midnight, and the ladies would just pass out at the sight of him. You understand? So right. Malcolm, that ain't something that he just forgot or he was too young to remember. This is reinvention. And by the way, I don't buy the title of Manning Marble, because reinvention, no, transformation.
That's right. That's
right. So another story that Malcolm tells, because this boost, well, I'll come back to why he did this later. So he tells you that he's introduced, because see, the autobiography is setting you up for this idea that Malcolm went from an A student or the second best student in his class to somebody that became almost illiterate. You believe that? How does that happen? And that he was somebody who, was, around white people and everything else, and then gets into Boston and becomes converted to the streets and becomes this stone criminal. Okay. Now, Okay, so one of the stories in the autobiography is that the shoe shine man that, he apprenticed under to learn how to shine shoes, which he already knew, but to shine them better, which did the shoe shine stuff outside of major jazz events. So this was a big thing. So Malcolm would make the point that a number of big jazz musicians would come by and he got acquainted with it, and he did the Lindy Hop and stuff and all that kind of stuff. But so this guy was the one that was supposed to have introduced him to hustling, selling weed, referring white men to black women, which made him a pimp. Malcolm was never a pimp. That's plain bull. You know what I mean? So what does he leave out here? Guess who the shoe shine man was? His sister's husband, Ella's husband. Right. Now, if you tell that, then it gives you a different version of Malcolm, the street guy, who's engaged in illegal activity, because shining shoes ain't illegal. So there was a few little side things they did on the side to make a little bit of extra money. But he was not being introduced into serious crime as a shoe shine boy. You understand? Then he gives you in the autobiography how he had reached the levels of degradation where he was a pimp, a burglar, which he did do some burglary,
right?
Amateur hour, encouraged by his white girlfriend, who was only 1 year older than him, by the way. In the autobiography, you're left with the impression this is an older white woman who happened to be Armenian, by the way.
Yeah.
Like honorary whites. And so, the Kardashians, you see them. Of course, they only go after the blacks with some money, you know what I mean? But the point is, so according to this story, he was a pimp. He was a burglar, which he did a little bit of.
Gambler.
A gambler. And that basically this was the main thing he did. And on the side, he did railroad work, where he eventually got fired. That was his story. Now, if you read The Seventh Child, you'll see that Malcolm had so many legitimate jobs, you can't count them. And he got all of them through the family. Note the family connection here. You understand?
Always.
So, and why did he get these legitimate jobs? He was afraid of Ella. Remember, he's a kid. I mean, he's tall and everything, but he's a kid. And Ella was very hard on him being legitimate, even though she did some shoplifting and stuff. That's a whole nother story, which he doesn't talk about in the autobiography.
Right.
Also a bad sister. Bad is unconscious. And someone who acquires property and gives Malcolm support. That's and a whole lot of other things, pays his way to Mecca and stood up to Elijah Muhammad in them. In terms of the nation, there's some stuff she did that Malcolm wouldn't do. And it was because she put her foot down. So she's a bad sister overall. So the point is, so this idea that he's into all this illegality, yeah, he was into a little bit of it. And it was an amateur hour. But a
lot of it was exaggerated.
Yeah,
it really was
exaggerated.
Yeah.
Now, there's another thing in here where, according to the autobiography, when they get caught in the burglary game, it's the women that turn them in. Guess what? Malcolm turned his own gang in. Did you know that, Raymond?
You got me on that one. I didn't know that one. Is that in the seventh
gang in? He turned them in. You hear me? Gave them up. Now you are not going to tell that, because aside from street creds, you lose it all together, because that right there is come on. You know what I mean? And it's the white women that refuse to turn the tables on him. That may have been pointed out in the autobiography or not. I don't remember, but they refused to go for the DA's charge that they were raped. They refused to do that.
Right. I know.
But, and of course, because they were white, their sentences were much more light. But you can imagine what Shorty thought of this. And so for a couple of years in prison, Shorty wouldn't even talk to him. Now, remember, he's a kid. So this is the other side.
Is that why Shorty didn't talk to him?
Yeah, that's a big reason why, because
I didn't know
he
that.
had been betrayed, because it was Malcolm's fault that they got caught, because he turned in a watch. This is told in the autobiography. This is not new. It was a specially designed watch to get it repaired. Burglars know that if they steal something, keep it. You don't turn it into nobody to look at it. And so the pawn shop owner referred that to the cops. So he set himself up to be arrested. You know what I mean? And then that's when he gives up his whole crew. So, so why did he do some of this? Well, first of all, it's obvious that when he is taking family members out of the picture and putting somebody who himself wasn't all that bad when it came to crime, Shorty, in his place, he's upping his criminal credentials. He's making it look like he was this fallen person, you know, this bad person who later could get resurrected, when in fact he wasn't all that bad off. Remember what his family always said about him. He was nice.
That's right.
That was always the thing about Malcolm. He was nice. You know what I mean? So he wasn't a hardcore criminal. In the case of the conch, the same thing. He's making it look like this is degradation, which you can say, yes, it is. You're imitating white people. But the fact is, he's imitating somebody he loved, he looked up to, who was hit. That ain't why he conked his head. You know what I mean? And then the con games and all of that. Again, if your family members are the ones who are teaching you amateur hour stuff, this isn't exactly a con man. You know what I mean? Or con skills or criminal activity. And then it's obvious he didn't give up on the story that he turned his crew in, because that's embarrassing. And there's some other things. And so Raymond's point that one of the reasons why the autobiography is suspect is because we're not going to tell on ourselves a lot of times.
Well, I don't, you know, somebody in the chat room, I think it's 5-star review, just said nobody, what does it say? Nobody writes a tell-all book on themselves.
Yeah,
I mean, nobody does that. One person that I'm close to, that you and I talked about the other night, she did not want to write a complete autobiography or a biography of some of the things that her husband did, and, you know, famous person. I think that's just the way it is. King probably never wrote an autobiography because of some of the things that he had done. So nobody writes. So I think that autobiography combined with biography is the way you should approach. You asked me the other day whether or not, you know, which one of these books you should read and hold as high. I think you got to read them both. I mean, you got to read what Malcolm said about himself and the stuff that he probably hid, but you also have to read other books to make sure that you have a fuller picture of Malcolm than you did, you know, people do. The same with anybody, though, with Garvey, with Booker T. Washington, with anybody. You got to read all of it.
Yeah. And what I'd say about the biography, while on the positive side, usually more research is being done. It's by someone other than the person himself.
That's
and
right.
If you've got a real good body of research, then you've got a pretty good biography. The biography on Ella Baker that is best is written by a sister who went and did detailed research on her. So that is a reconstruction of her life.
That's right.
So that even then there are weaknesses. For example, Les Payne in his biography, because we can get into some of the things that Les Payne points out, it's a masterpiece. And you know, you make the point that in terms of detail, it's more detailed than anything else that's come out. And so that's one thing. And then he's an investigative journalist, 6-time Pulitzer Prize winner. Mm-hmm. So he's got some skills that he honed in this, because you make the point that he interviewed over 100 people. And when you fact check this, what did you find when you fact checked this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I went through the book. I had what you call it? What's the name of Knopf? They gave me about a month to fact check the book, and I had to go through it. I stayed up night after night just reading the book and so forth. I only found about 4 or 5 errors, I mean factual errors in the book. there are many, and you pointed out one the other night. I hope you can talk about one of those, in fact, a little bit, maybe not give the name of the person. But I think that in fact checking the book, I was incredibly impressed with his detail on the meeting with the Ku Klux Klan. Um, Malcolm was forced, that's the only way to describe it, him and Jeremiah X, to go to the meeting with the Ku Klux Klan that by Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm didn't want to go. It was they had no respect for Malcolm or Jeremiah in the meeting, and it seems afterwards you could say that informed Malcolm a lot towards the Nation of Islam. He did not. It seemed like he never actually got over that, Oba. That it was something that he just couldn't get. He couldn't shake loose on it, and I had never read that. I mean, I knew that they had met, as did Marcus Garvey with the KKK, but Payne's description of that meeting and the detail is just overwhelming. The other thing I love about the book is that I think he finally uplifts Malcolm's mother as a strong, we see her as a tragic figure that was, mental health problems and all of this, but she was a very powerful figure. And I think that Payne, gave that impression, because the women you can't, underestimate the role that women played in his life. Ella, his mother. There's so many people and women, and I think that Payne did a good job of that too.
Yeah, in terms of Langdon Little, Malcolm's mother, who was from Grenada, and we showed a picture of her earlier. I did a show on her. One of the reasons why Payne's book is so good is he's interviewing Wilford, the oldest son, and so he has the best memory of his mother, whereas Malcolm was very young, and the incident where she's standing down the Klan, she's pregnant with him, and so he's told about some of these things, or it's faded memory as a child, and so he talked about how she taught their children race pride. And while she was called light complexion, if you saw that picture, she wasn't all that light complexion.
Right.
But with Black people, light is
relative.
Yeah, it's crazy compared to somebody else. So she had taught Malcolm, and in the autobiography, he makes that point, not to take any pride in being light complexion, a message that he didn't get because of the breakup of his family. Later, he would get that message. She was somebody that was a major figure in the Universal Negro Improvement Association.
Yes.
She wrote a regular column for it. And sometimes, as Les Payne's book points out, bringing up the role of her husband, Malcolm's father, and leading the Omaha chapter and other branches of the UNIA. When Garvey was on the run, he was under prosecution by the FBI, then the Internal Bureau of Investigation. He stayed at her house. And Payne is detailed enough to say he didn't stay overnight. But the key point is, Payne didn't note that one of the security people for Garvey was a cousin of Langdon Little. You understand? Wow. So, and that West Indian thing Caribbean thing was real strong in the Garvey organization. Malcolm, I made the point that when Malcolm met with us, he would sit with his back to the wall with newspapers in front of him. A major way that his mother taught was with newspapers. Their children, when they came home from school, she would have the Independence newspaper from Grenada, and she would have the Negro World, Garvey's newspaper.
Garvey's News, right.
And she would teach from both of them. And when the kids could not remember or did not know the meaning of a word, she'd say, go to the dictionary. Okay. Now note, Malcolm is using the same method when he's meeting with us. And what did he do when he's in prison? He went to the dictionary to rehab his whole vocabulary, in part because of his mother and in part because of his master, his first master was Paul Robeson. And this is generally not known. And before, even though Elijah and the Nation was having its influence, Paul Robeson was the political influence on Malcolm. And one of the things Paul was into was language. And it was in linguistics, but it was also in using animal analogies and stuff, which was one of Malcolm's favorite methods for communicating. So these were some of the things. And then, the book points out, Les Payne's book, that Malcolm's mother said, Langdon Little, she married her husband so she could darken the race. In other words, they considered her light complexion, and a lot of proud light-skinned Black women will say that. I want to get me some black blood in here. You know what I mean? I don't want all this light stuff in here. That was part of her pride. You know what I mean?
Right.
So she was not a tragic figure. The other thing is, and the seventh child brings this out. When Malcolm's in prison, his mother is still in a nut house, and she had only had a nervous breakdown. She was never mentally disturbed. Malcolm thought so. And that also affected why it took him so long to get her out. And it also affected why the woman that he really loved, he didn't end up marrying, because he believed that mental illness ran in the family, which it did not. You know what I mean? And so she's sending him a letter when he's in prison. And this is a very important piece of advice. She said, don't serve time. Make time serve you.
That's right.
That's what she did. And so, and did Malcolm take advantage of that? Hell yeah.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, so many, all of that, the strength that after Malcolm's father died, how she kept the family together. And was willing to, to protect them by any means necessary, to anticipate Malcolm's famous phrase. And it must have been, I always imagined that when Malcolm was in prison, he found out that his mother had been, in, a mental institution. It must have tore him up. But, the women in his life, again, I think were underplayed in the autobiography. But again, I think Payne and Payne's daughter, Tamara, brought them out a lot in the book, The Dead Are Rising.
Yeah. So, yeah, you're right. And then Malcolm grew on the issue of women, and particularly Black women, because in the autobiography, he makes the statement that he only trusted women, Black women, 75% of the time.
Right.
But by the time when he's out of the Nation, he's leaving the Organization of Afro-American Unity. When he went to Africa, and one of his trips was to a sister. And she was running the organization. And I'm sure some of the men had trouble with that. So, and then he made comments like, he said, you can measure the level of a race by the level of its women. Right. And so, and he was always respectful of Black people, particularly when he was conscious of Black people in general and Black women in particular. Farrakhan made the comment, he never heard Malcolm say a negative thing about Black people, and especially Black women.
That's something.
That was Malcolm. And he didn't play around. You know what I mean?
That's
he didn't
right.
play around. And in fact, Betty said he was compensating for all the stuff he had done before. You know what I mean? So he was doing self-correction, but he had that kind of discipline. So that was all important. Now, one of the chief weaknesses, because biographies have their weaknesses too, and in the case of Payne, I think his strength is that he was a master news reporter and researcher, and 6 Pulitzer Prizes is nothing to just close your eyes on. That's excellence. And when you read how he wrote this book, you can see he's a master writer. In addition to the detail, the way he opens it and everything else, he's got all of that going too. But the chief weakness that I see in him, it doesn't mar the book. I think that this is the best book that's been put out on the biography, is that he was not an authority on Malcolm. And he did have research assistants. But the point is, there are some things that he would have had in this book had he been thoroughly embedded in the scholarship on Malcolm, which most journalists don't do to begin with. So it's asking
That's agreed.
that they don't do. So, but here's the key point. So, and I was talking to you about this last night. It's a common statement that's made about Malcolm's father, that he was a carpenter, for example. Well, Wilford corrected that one. Wilford made the point in this, again, the book, The Seventh Child, which apparently he didn't make again when he was being interviewed by Les Payne, probably because he wasn't asked. And so he makes a point. No, and according to Les Payne, he was trained in carpentry in school in the South.
Right.
He might have had some finishing touches, but the fact is he was a master builder. He wasn't a carpenter. He built a house from the bottom up, and he did all the finishing touches. And I'm using the term from Wilford to describe that. But here's the key point. So that's one thing. Here's the key point. Had he read The Seventh Child, he would have known something that Malcolm didn't know, and only his family knew. And Malcolm had an influence on this because the film Roots by Alex Haley influenced his family to begin to have family meetings. And one of the family members did research on the family tree. Some of the people that have heard me before have heard me say this, but others have not heard this. And they discovered their African ancestor. His name was Ajar, A-J-A-R. He was 6'4", black as midnight. He was a master builder and he was a warrior. And according to Malcolm's sister, she believed he was Bambara, B-A-M-B-A-R-A. They misspell the name of the ethnic group in this book. And it's interesting, it may well have been. And what's interesting is the Bambara were nominal Muslims. She said he would be a Muslim, but they were basically traditionalists. They learned their culture the same way the Dogon did. Now, he was noted for not taking any mess from white people during slavery. And he disappears in the family record because he was either killed or sold. It was very unlikely he was killed because with his valuable skills. Now, the other thing is, this is funny because Malcolm always talked about he was a field Negro, not a house Negro. He was a house Negro. But he was a different kind because Malcolm was generally right. The house Negro loved the master more than the master loved himself, blah, blah, blah. But that wasn't always the case. You had house Negroes that hated the master, glass to him,
and poisoned him.
Oh, yeah. And ran away at the same rate as field Negroes. And their people were all in the field. So they were angry at the brutality that their people faced in the field and sometimes sought revenge in the house. So in this particular case, he was a house black. That would have been funny to Malcolm. But the key point is this. The militancy and the African orientation of the bulk of the little family, not all of them were militant, but most of them were, goes directly back to Ajar. And the skill of building was passed from Ajar to his son, to his son, to his son, to Malcolm's father.
That's right.
And whatever finishing touches he got later. And interestingly enough, when Malcolm's teacher is telling him he should be a carpenter rather than a lawyer, well, that's racism. He wanted to be a lawyer. But he was observing a skill that Malcolm had. He did have a skill at building. He just chose to put it in another direction, building people rather than building an organization. Now, there's another one. In the autobiography, Malcolm said that his mother, Langdon Little's mother, had been raped. And Malcolm said he hated that white blood that was in him. It was a rapist blood. Now, this ain't Malcolm's fault. This is what his mother told him.
Right.
His mother was not telling the truth, just straight up. The mother wanted to invest some pride in this white blood in her, so she wanted to say it was forced on her. But when the book on Malcolm X's mother was written, it was on brother who wrote it went to Grenada, interviewed people that knew Malcolm's mother, and they said Malcolm's mother's mother had been warned by her mother not to play around with what she called a hit and run white man. He was a white man that would have sex with black women and then move on to the next one. She didn't listen. She ended up with an affair with him, and that's where Langdon Little came from. So Malcolm's not to be at fault for this. It's a mother.
Yeah, he didn't know. He didn't know.
He didn't know. So these are some examples of the problem with the biography. But I would say that The Dead Are Arising is a masterpiece. And I would say that I was suspicious because anytime I hear that a journalist has written anything, I'm suspicious. But when I looked at how smart he was and how he used his techniques, who he went after to interview, you know what I mean? And the amount of information that he compiled that's absolutely new, I said,
That's right. Well, by the way, somebody in the chat room said, what's the name of the book on Malcolm's mother?
I don't remember. I have to go back because I was looking for it before the show.
Right.
But go to my show on Malcolm's mother, and it's there, and I'll post it later. I don't remember.
Let's spend a few minutes. What did you think about the assassination, which is still controversy, or how he treated the assassination?
Yeah, I saw somebody in here saying the government was in it. Yeah, they were in it, but what people need to do is go to the discussion that I had with Babazak Kondo, who wrote the book, The Assassination of Malcolm X, all scholars on the assassination. I'm not an expert on that. I dealt with his political thought.
Right.
His life. And I have a chapter on the assassination, but I didn't plunge into that. He did. He went to the FBI files. He did detailed research. So Earl Evans, who wrote the book, The Judas Factor, which is supposed to be on the assassination, concedes that Babazak Kondo has done the best work.
Yeah.
And he concludes that the Nation of Islam did it. Yeah. That's his conclusion. And by the way, there's over 4,000, 5,000 people that have viewed this show on my show, which is big a number for me, and over 300 comments and not one negative, because this was not a hit on the Nation. It was data, and the data clearly shows it. Now, the FBI was in it. Malcolm is trying to get back in after suspension. The government, the FBI, is getting the mail that he's sending to the messenger and rewriting the letters and sending it to the messenger, whereas he's pleading to come back. These letters are hostile. So this is causing the Nation to, the messenger to not do what he might have done. But from all indications, the hit on Malcolm coming from the Nation was that Malcolm was radical. Malcolm wanted to take the Nation political. Number one, the Nation's a 501c3. If it does, it loses its tax-exempt status. Though there's a way to avoid that. You can create another organization that would be politically active. But number two, Malcolm was both spiritual and political, and more political than spiritual, and radical. He was a revolutionary in the Nation, a revolutionary outside, and more so outside. And the messenger was not. And so there was a constant friction between Malcolm and the messenger over Malcolm's politics. The messenger didn't like it. In the early period, he didn't try and muffle him as much because he was getting membership out of it.
That's right.
$75 million Malcolm's organizing did for the Nation. He built it from a broke organization to worth $75 million. But as Maulana Karinga points out in one of the articles he did on Malcolm, he points out the iron law of oligarchy. That law says that the more conservative, the more successful a group gets, the more conservative they're likely to become.
Right.
The Nation was never radical to begin with, but as they get the comfort goodies, more money is coming in from dues coming from members and everything else, there's a real investment in holding on to these things. So there's no question about that. You know what I mean? You might not want to hear it, but there's no question on that. But the FBI was involved and the CIA was involved. And the CIA involvement has not been properly documented.
Right, and maybe never will. What I always tell people, it was part of the nation, but it was also part of the government that killed Malcolm. It was I, for one, did not know, and I learned this from reading Payne's book. I did not know that at the time of his assassination, that Malcolm had a gun on him, and that New York City cop that was his, quote, bodyguard was trying to get the gun away from him because they did not. And Payne goes into detail about this. Malcolm was not prepared to shoot, because of where the gun was in his, in his rear, on his belt. But I think that we cannot underestimate or underplay the role that the government have. And again, I don't know if we'll ever find out what the CIA did. You want to say something about the poisoning too?
That would indicate the CIA's involvement.
Exactly.
Malcolm, when he was in Egypt, after he took a few bites of a meal, remembered that the person that served him had been following him in New York. And so he stopped eating. But his stomach had to be pumped because the doctors that pumped it said he had been poisoned. And so that poisoning had to be CIA. That's right. Because the nation couldn't reach there. And also at the time of his assassination, a few weeks later, Malcolm was scheduled to speak at a major international conference in Africa. And they wanted to prevent that. So there was definitely their hand in it. And in terms of the nation was penetrated by the FBI. And Elijah knew who some of these people were. He may not have known all of them. He knew that John Ali was an agent. Not an agent, he was an informant, because at that time, the FBI hired no Black agents. Right. And in fact, guess who referred him to the messenger? Malcolm. Malcolm was criticized by Louis Lomax for this. Louis Lomax is a writer who wrote a book, When the Word is Given. He's the one that set up the interview on TV of the Nation, When the Word is Given, Mike Wallace interview that kind of put the Nation out there positively and negatively because they were treated as the hate that hate produced. Yeah. So Lomax had been critical of this for a long time. Malcolm didn't know he was an agent. And thing is, when he put John Ali in the national office, he becomes second to the messenger. That's and right. I have a friend who woke me up, who was a photographer for the Nation. He was in Corps and then later went into the Nation of Islam. He became a photographer for the Nation of Islam. And I asked him for John Ali's profile. He said his profile was that he was very efficient, whatever he organized work. He was the person that signed up Talmadge Hayer to assassinate Malcolm.
Wow.
But the key point is, understand this, there had been an agreement coming from the Nation. So don't underestimate that part, because the autobiography points out that the Nation had ordered the bombing of Malcolm's car. That's one thing. There's a point where Malcolm is under threat from almost every Nation of Islam mosque in the country.
That's right.
So everywhere he went. So if that's the case, then that is not the case of a sporadic thing. There's a decision made, and that in the Nation was a hierarchy. And so that decision came down. And so everybody was out to get him. Not everybody in the Nation wanted to do it, but I'm saying it was coming from all over. So You don't want to hear that? I'm sorry. And by the way, the assassination attempts I faced was all blacks trying to kill me, but they were coming from the government. I don't blame Black people for that. But in this particular case, that's what happened. It's a shame, but it's a fact.
It is. Well, this has been good, man.
Yeah. Any other things that you think that was brought out in Les Payne's book that was particularly important?
Well, I just like, there was so much. He went into detail about I mean, Malcolm mentions it a little bit, but Chicago Red was a guy by the name of Red Fox, and Detroit Red, of course, was Malcolm, and they stole together, and they would steal from dry cleaners and get up on the roof and then sell these suits, in Harlem and stuff like that. That's just, I think that just fleshed out for me a lot of what Malcolm was about. Now, Malcolm doesn't go into detail in that in an autobiography because, again, like somebody said in the chat room, nobody is totally honest about their own lives. They just aren't. But and it's interesting that Red Fox, in his career, he never said anything negative about Malcolm X, in his career as a comedian. And he could have easily done that. Mm-hmm. So I just think that Payne's biography ought to be read. Most of us have only read the autobiography of Malcolm X, which is good. It should be read. But I think there's a variety of books. You've showed me some books that I was totally unaware of. I ordered The Seventh Son and making sure that I read that as well. And wish I'd read it before I did, some of the fact checking on Les Payne's book.
Yeah, it's an excellent book. I see here. So I want to thank you for that. Let's go to some of the comments they made. Mr. K, Rodno Collins and Professor James Smalls said the same thing, that it was criminal elements of the NOI individuals that were working in cohort with the government forces. Got any comment on that?
I agree with that. I mean, I read one person who said, well, I'll never forgive Minister Farrakhan for his complicity in the assassination. Look, back in the day, as Minister Farrakhan is, admitted, there were several people. I remember when Elijah Muhammad said somebody needs to close that brother's eyes, and if you were back in the day and when Elijah Muhammad would say something like that, that triggered, as you just pointed out, anybody could have assassinated, and everybody wanted to. I shouldn't say everybody, but anybody could have assassinated Malcolm X. Those times were, I guess people would say, high and heady. And I think that the fact of the matter that, Minister Farrakhan and Betty Shabazz at the Harlem Theater, at the Apollo Theater, publicly acknowledged his complicity and did it in an interview with George Curry, also in about 91 or 90 in Emerge magazine, and talked about, setting the atmosphere, as he put it, for that. So I hope that we don't still use the division that white folks started with the Nation of Islam and Malcolm's assassination and still continue it today with Minister Farrakhan.
Yeah, but I'm going to say that
I know you'll say
people need to watch the show on Babazak Kondo and read his book, The Assassination of Malcolm X. Read it. Go through the details, because a lot of people who are drawing conclusions on this haven't done the reading.
Yeah.
Some that are being quoted up here right now, and I've talked to some of them. I'm not going to give their name. Now, so this thing here, Mr. K, Rodney Collins, and Professor James Small said the same thing. It was the criminal elements of the NOI that were working in cohorts with the government forces. Well, if you read the book, The Judas Factor, it shows that the assassins of Malcolm came out of the Newark Mosque.
Yeah.
And that includes the one assassin who admits to it. Others, like a guy named William Bradley, who's the one that pulled the shotgun and murdered him and walked around free, was never arrested or anything else. They were in line with the national office. So people should put the whole thing together. I mean, if you're going to say something, put the whole thing together. And there's more to it than that. So all I'm saying is, you don't like that, but guess what? In struggles, some things aren't pretty.
That's right. That's right.
Side of it. And be honest, I know more than I'm talking here, because when I do my revision on the book on Malcolm, I know stuff that Baba Zakano doesn't know, but that's for later. Let's see. Book on Louise Landon Early Little, The Diasporic Journey of Louis Little, Grassroots Garveyism, the Midwest Community Feminism, Women, Gender, and Family of Color. So she's given some, but that's not the name of the particular book on the mother. Let's see if there's any others. Okay, the Nation Old Guard were anti-female in regard to the OAAU. Yes, referring to the fact that in the OAAU, Organization of Afro-American Unity, as Malcolm began to grow, it did cause on women and a number of other things, did cause some problems for older Nation of Islam members who were in Garvey's organization.
Mr. K says John Henry Clark once said this very quote, "I not only believe this, but I literally know this, and I know the name of the CIA agent or conduit of any money that was fed into the NOI by the CIA."
Yeah, that's very likely, you know.
Yeah.
Makes sense to me. Blah, blah, blah.
You want Francine Leonard's ask Baba, do you have a store on the internet that sells your books? You know, how do you get the Art of Leadership, which I think are just, you gotta read Oba's book about that.
Yeah, go to Gumroad. You'll see right here under your screen, it shows you where you go to order books. Go to Gumroad, and I think it shows it there. And if it's not here, then click in when you're coming into the show, and you'll see Gumroad. Just go directly to it, and you can order it directly through there.
That's it.
The complex. Okay. Mr. K, Jewel, also Boniface, blah, blah. Friend of Malcolm was working on a book about Malcolm's travels to Africa, how he became even more of a threat, was killed before he could complete it. Yeah. What I like about Mr. K, what I like about Professor James Smalls is how his insights always stresses that Malcolm's assassination was complex and bigger than that, than those NOI figures who participated in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but when you get corrupted, and here's the big deal, when money becomes more important to you than anything,
that's right,
you're bound to do almost anything. And so don't underestimate that one. Don't underestimate it. Of all the vices, that's the worst one. Greed. When you get into greed, you don't know what's going to happen. Okay, Mr. K, Professor James Smalls did also stress that because the autobiography was originally meant to promote the NOI, so he exaggerated a lot of his past, including the criminal stuff, to complement the NOI program. Yeah, there's some truth to that. But it's more than that. It's also to keep himself looking good. Mr. K, also bear in mind that the autobiography was a rush project as Malcolm was traveling a lot, 64, 65, so a lot of history was likely to be left out. Want to make any comment on that?
Well, one thing that, and I've got it up here in my library, something I did a review for the Journal of African American History. Malcolm kept a diary in the last year of his life. And I can't think, and it's published now. I want to say, I don't think Third World Press published it, but I forget who published that. And I did a review of the book. But you may want to read that because
I read it.
Yeah, okay. And do you know who publishes it?
No, I've got the book over here. But
yeah, but and I didn't know that he is, and it's called The Diary of Malcolm X. and you may want to pick that up because it gives some of his thoughts during the last year of his life. And he was traveling, as Mr. K said, was traveling a great deal during that last year.
I was disappointed because that book doesn't tell hardly anything about what actually happened in his travels. And Malcolm was very silent on what was said between him and Nkrumah, what was said between him and Nyerere, a host of others, for probably some very good reason. But that travel diary doesn't reveal much of anything. I have the Schoenberg stuff on Malcolm. I've read that stuff. But
I can't wait for your next book to come out, your revision of your book on Malcolm to come out. You got to put all this stuff in there, Oba.
I got some stuff in there that that's all I can say.
We're gonna have a show on you after that one, man.
Let's see. Mr. K, Seeing Red, Federal Campaigns Against Black Militancy, 1919 to 1925 by Theodore Korn Webel is a great read. That's very good. People note these readings. This is part of why I do the show. I'm going to write that down myself, is to learn something. Pick the book up. I'm going to pick it up. Yeah. Let's see if there's anything else up here. Okay, that was already there. That was there. Okay, I think most of this up here. Okay, Castro, we covered that. And Jabal Tariq, Gates cannot carry Booker T's shoes. Booker built institutions that are still useful to today. The most prominent is Tuskegee Institute, Premier School of Army Cooks and Veterinary Studies. Yeah, and agricultural science and a whole bunch of other stuff. Yeah, true. Very true. And he was doing his stuff under difficult circumstances, to say the very least.
Somebody's asking about donations. You can see that in the trailer under the screen to Dr. Oba T'Shaka's show. Somebody asked, when are you going to revise your book on Malcolm X?
Well, see, I'm finishing the book on I've reached 670 pages. That's a replacement teaching system. Yeah. And then I'm going to write on the San Francisco Freedom Movement. And then I'm going to do one on world history. And then after that, I'll do the Malcolm X book.
Goodness, man. Okay.
So, because as important as Malcolm is, I got some things I have to finish.
Right.
I'm
looking at fire on this show.
Okay. M. Jewell says, wasn't there a black man who on his dying bed admitted to knowing more about Malcolm's death, yet couldn't speak on it for fear of losing his job? This was within the past year. Have you heard anything about that?
I heard it, but somebody wrote about it on Twitter, but I didn't read it in depth. I'm sorry about that. That is out there, though.
Mm-hmm. People should watch the series that James Smalls is an advisor on, Godfather of Harlem, and Forrest Whitaker is the star. Have you watched any of those?
I've watched about 2 or 3 episodes. It ain't bad. I mean, it's got Malcolm in there. The Godfather of Harlem is some real stuff. The portrayal of Malcolm is partially fictional, but it's interesting. I'll put it that way. It's interesting.
And it's I see here that there's a comment on that. Smalls has put his own stuff in there. And I think he's taken, because it's literary truth, so truth, but not always truth, but within a context that's true. Exactly. And the big one that I think is a distortion is this idea that the messenger was giving Malcolm terms for coming back in. And if Malcolm come back in, if he would give up on his politics, that never happened.
Exactly.
So that one I thought was taken out of context, period. And it'll make NOI people feel happy, but that just ain't the truth.
That's true. That's right. That's
But
right.
other than that, I thought that Smalls did, and we've talked, and I've told him some stuff about some stuff. He said, I'll think about it. But I think he's done a great job on that. And Smalls does a good job anyway. Smalls is a good.
Yeah, he's good. He's very, very exact. So
Yeah, and he's a good brother. He cares about black people. He got some street smarts, and so they couldn't have done a better job in having somebody. Because even down to the Godfather of Harlem's straight razor, and also his Geechee Club, which Smalls was into because he was a Geechee,
right.
South Carolina, and then the Godfather apparently had some connection. And there's a truth here also that the Godfather of Harlem, he offered Malcolm protection. Malcolm turned it down. This was after he had been exited from the nation and was fearful for his life. So then he builds a whole thing around that. He's got him in his house. He's actually stopping somebody from killing him. So that didn't happen. But the main point is that this guy did have a relationship with Malcolm and tried to help him out.
Right. I'll give him that.
Yeah. Okay, that looks like that's it, brother.
This has been good, man. We got to do this again, man, on some other stuff.
You better believe it. In fact, I'd like you to put together a reparations panel for me. Where we could, get some people to deal with that.
Yeah, I'll do that because you guys out in California are leading the way in this stuff. And some of it's good and some of it's bad, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
But we'll do that, okay?
Okay. Yeah. Right. Bumpy is the Godfather of Harlem. Okay, so thank you, brother.
All right.
This is enjoyable.
All right, we'll do it again.
Good work, brother.
You keep up the good work, man. You're doing a great work, man. Great work.
Yeah, well, you're my buddy. So, Hotep, thank you.